point to
Order.
the issues of
Order.
integrity that
Order.
membership
Order.
read.
Is this in the public domain? Yes. Well, it will not be tabled and cannot seek leave. I'm calling. This is a split call between Mana and Labour. I'm calling a member. I will ring the bell with a minute to go. Honi Haruera.
Tēnā koe, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this morning I sent an open letter to overseas investors via all of the biggest newspapers in the G20 countries where most interest is likely to come from for the purchase of shares in the assets that this national government is trying to flog off. And it reads like this. Tēnā koutou katoa. The New Zealand government is proposing to sell shares in 5 state-owned enterprises to repay overseas debt. That proposal is opposed by an overwhelming majority of New Zealanders who believe that assets built up through the hard work of generations of New Zealanders should not be sold to investors whose primary objective is not the public good but private profit, and that electricity assets in particular should be held by the government on behalf of all New Zealanders for the benefit of all New Zealanders and hopefully at a price we can all afford. As the Indigenous people of Aotearoa Māori have been even stronger in their opposition. The Māori view is that no asset sale should proceed until Māori interest in those assets have been properly addressed. Māori have already made application to the Waitangi Tribunal to block the legislation. A separate case is being prepared to go to the High Court. Steps are being taken to present a case at the United Nations under the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and Māori groups have pledged to take action against sales to overseas interests which impact on Māori sovereignty. And in a related case, of course, following months of public protest, the High Court has called on the New Zealand government to reconsider a decision to approve the sale of farmlands to overseas interests. So today I think it only proper to send a warning to overseas investors: steer clear of any share offer in the above New Zealand state-owned enterprises. The purchase of these shares is likely to see you caught up in legal battles and direct action from citizens determined to protect their interests, both of which will be lengthy and costly and have an adverse impact on the value of your investment. As the leader of the Mana movement and member of the New Zealand House of Representatives for the electorate of Taitokero, I wish to advise that Mana is opposed to the privatisation of state assets and will strongly argue for any shares sold to overseas investors to be returned to New Zealand hands. Overseas investors, you have been warned. Mr. Speaker, Mana opposes this bill because it is a fraud. When government says these companies will have improved public scrutiny, they're lying. The legislation specifically states that these...
Order. Member can't say that the government is lying, so I ask the member to withdraw that comment. And I'll also remind the member of standing orders. In the standing orders review, one is not allowed to read their speech straight off a script, or in this case off the machine. There is on page 28 of the standing orders which were accepted by this House late last year, refer to your notes, but you can't just read them verbatim. I just remind the member of that. Honi Haruera. Well, I've got 2 points of order. I'll take Materia Ture first. I'm sorry, because she...
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just in reference to clarify this new rule about reading speeches, my understanding from the Standing Orders report and from the Standing Orders Committee discussions on the issue, that it was reaffirmed that it is a convention that MPs preferably not speak directly from written notes, but that it is not a rule, and that the Speaker may use his or her discretion, but that members are entitled to use their notes as a guide, and that it is not a rule, according to the Standing Orders Committee, that MPs do not read their speeches.
Thank you. Well, as you rightly said, they can use it to refer to, and that's exactly why I mentioned to the honourable member that reading a speech verbatim under the standing orders, and I refer to the report that was adopted by this House, and it's on page 28. It sets out clearly there reading of speeches, and so I've mentioned that to the member. He has 2 minutes remaining of his speech. The Honourable Teriana Turia.
I want to follow up, Mr. Speaker, on the matter that Metiria Tude has raised in the House. My understanding is that the wording is where possible. Members should not read speeches. And it depends on the technicality of the speeches. So my understanding is that in some speeches it is perfectly possible for you to read your notes. And I want to be clear about that because we have some treaty speeches being made in the House tonight, many of them of a technical nature, and I don't want to see the interruption because, to be frank with you, Mr. Speaker, you were sitting in the chair when I was interrupted by the Labor Party in a speech that I was making, and you allowed the interruption, and it's very clear that only the Speaker can interrupt the Speaker.
The member is correct, and can I just refer then to page 28? The member is correct that where such and this is the last couple of sentences, which picks up on the point the member made. Such circumstances, this is where a member can read their speech, may relate to a technical nature of the material under discussion or the relative experience of the member concerned. There will, however, be occasions when it is not inappropriate for speeches to be read. So that picks up on the point, and later on in the debates, as you mentioned, when we move on to the treaty settlements, could well be appropriate. And I'm going to invite Honi Hawera has 2 minutes remaining.
Speaking to the point of order...
No, I've already ruled.
Okay.
Member will continue speech.
When government says these companies will have improved public scrutiny, I would like to point out that the legislation specifically states that these newly established companies will no longer be subject to the Official Information Act or the Ombudsman Act. When government tells you that they have Māori support for these proposals, I would like to point out that not one Māori who attended the 10 consultation hui all around the country supported the proposal to open up the sale of state-owned assets to overseas investors. And when government says that mom and pop investors will be at the front of the queue, I would like to point out, Mr. Speaker, that there are no provisions in the legislation to guarantee New Zealanders will get preferential treatment or even a dedicated percentage of the shares. And when government tells you that it is not possible to buy non-Crown groups to treaty provisions, Mr. Speaker, I would like to point out that government already imposes constraints on third parties through treaty memorials over state-owned enterprise properties. Mr. Speaker, Mana opposes this bill because it is an act of treason against the very people we are supposed to represent, because it is deceitful to Māori and an insult to our founding document.
Order. The member can't accuse anyone of treason, and I'll ask the member to withdraw and apologise for that comment.
Speaking to the...
No.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Point of order, Honi Hawera.
I didn't accuse anyone of treason. Would you like me to repeat the words? I might have to refer to my notes.
Now that's trifling with the chair. I'll ask the member to continue his speech, and if I was in error in interpretation, then I was in error. I'll just ask the member with a minute remaining to finish his speech. And along the lines that I mentioned before, it should be a speech. This is a debating chamber. It's not a speech contest. And I'll ask the member to keep that in mind. Honi Hawera.
Mr. Speaker, Mana opposes this bill because it is deceitful to Māori and an insult to our founding document, the Treaty of Waitangi, and because it ignores the reality that once those shares are sold, investors will demand an ever-increasing return, which will come about courtesy of more and more price rises. We already know the horror stories of families who can't afford to pay their power bills, no heating, no light, often no refrigeration. We know only too well the cost to society of the massive costs associated with poor people suffering from cold and damp housing. This bill will simply increase that poverty. And finally, Mr. Speaker, I call on all Mana members to take whatever action is necessary to expose the greed behind these plans.
Sorry to interrupt the honourable member. His time has expired.
Thank you very much.
Call the Honourable Shane Jones.
Tēnā koe, Mr.